Okay, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you're listening from. I hope we find ourselves in good health and happiness, and blessings from Australia to wherever you are. Okay, the parsha of this week that we're going to discuss is the parsha's Shmini. In relationship to Parsha Shmini, it connects to all the teachings and readings that we've been doing most recently about the building of the Mishkan. The name of the Seder Shmini refers to actually the day on which Aaron and his sons are inducted as the priests who will be in the sanctuary, in the Mikdash. But it's also the day which the full presence of Hashem is revealed. And the parsha of description is called Shmini, which means the eighth day. So that has an implication. That implication is that it follows the 7 days during when the Mishkan was being consecrated, but it wasn't necessarily the fullest continuation of them, because what was happening in the first 7 days was an actual beginning of the activity of the Mishkan, and they were conceptually representative of man's efforts, his Avodah, and the man's efforts to bring Hashem close into his orbit by preparing themselves, by consecrating themselves, meaning Aaron and man in general, and bringing down Hashem into the world. Whereas the eighth day was the moment when Hashem answers these efforts by actually revealing himself, and that surely there's no comparison between what a person does and the actual response from Hashem, because one is finite, man's efforts are finite, and Hashem revealing himself and Hashem's revelation is in another plane altogether. It's an infinite. So how can the parsha be called the eighth day as if it's just a continuation of the previous 7? It's not really a continuation. There's an infinite gap between the two. Now, in this class, we'll be using a teaching of the Lubavitcher Rebbe to explore the relationship of the idea between man's effort and Hashem's and God's response. Man's effort to bring God into this world and divine revelation. And the example is what we do with the Mishkan. And we'll go through a number of examples of equivalence. So let's start. The idea that our Sedra begins with the words B'yom Shmini, that happened on the eighth day. And the famous commentator on the Torah, the Kli Yakar, in his commentary to the Torah, asks why this day, which is actually, as we just preluded before, why this day, following 7 days of really consecration of the Mishkan, but preparatory, is called the eighth day. For this implies that it's just a natural continuation of the previous days. But in fact, the consecration was limited to 7 days, and there were a number of rules that the Kahanim had to do in that they shouldn't go out from the tent of meeting for the 7 days till all the days of the consecration had to be fulfilled. And the commandment was that there's a consecration for 7 days. Now, during that time, the altar was dedicated, and the next day, which is the eighth day, was quite a separate day. It was set aside for the inauguration of Aaron and his sons to come to the priesthood. So, in essence, they're different. the answer which the Kli Yoker gives, that it's called the eighth day to emphasize its total different character, its extraordinary character, because because the verse says, and on this day Hashem appeared to you, and to explain why it was then that Hashem appeared and not during the actual days of consecration. The Torah tells us that it was actually because this day is the eighth day. What's the meaning behind that? And it's because, and we've discussed at different times before, that seven is the number of days of the week. It's a measure of time in relationship to a man, to a human, a finite human's experience. It's the measure of earthly time, a symbol of the world, of the physical world, and its cycles of activity. It's a symbol of the human dimension, while eight signifies something more than the human. It's a symbol of something separateness, which, after all, the idea of separateness is the idea of holiness. Kodesh, the word for holy, means it's separate. And that's, for instance, why circumcision can be performed on the Shabbos day. Normally, we say that we can't profane the Shabbos. We can't do activities which you're not allowed to do on the Shabbos, which they're considered malachim. But we have an overriding commandment. Circumcision has to be on the eighth day of birth, and Shabbos is seventh day. And if the day of the bris milah turns out to be on a Shabbos, the circumcision overrides it. Why is that? Because Shabbos is something which, although consecrated by Hashem himself, it follows the human time pattern. But circumcision, the mitzvah, belongs to a realm of the holy, of Kodesh, something which goes beyond, and therefore it has a spiritual, a higher dimension, and therefore it overrides the Shabbos itself, and we're allowed to do the circumcision. But why? Because it is the eighth. To say that seven is the span of a week doesn't necessarily mean that it's a week, an aspect of the weekday world. After all, Shabbat itself is one of those 7 days, and it's a day of holiness. But nevertheless, it's reckoned and it's considered as one of the 7 days of creation, and therefore belongs into the created order of man. Whereas the number 8 expresses the idea of being beyond the normal restrictions of time, and thus being wholly united with Hashem. And it's as if he himself, rather than how Hashem is to himself in a wholly separate way, than he is related to the world. And the Kli Yoker cites an example of this idea of the number 8, which then is an interesting teaching, that in the times when the harp will be used in the temple, it'll be considered, or it has to be produced from it has to be used as a harp with 8 strings. Normally, as was used in the harp in the sanctuary, as in the Beis Hamikdash, as part of the musical accompaniment of the korbanos, it was a harp made of 7 strings. But the harp which is in the times which are beyond man's existence, the harp of Messi, or the beyond normal, what we call reality these days, it will be in the harp of Messianic times, will have 8. So the Torah has responses of with aspects when we want to go beyond the state of regular existence, and expression of 8. So therefore, that gives us an indication that in holiness itself, there is holiness which is contained within the number seven, for instance, like the Shabbos, and there's aspects of holiness which which go beyond that. There is aspects of holiness which are locked into the human expression and the human experience, and then there's levels of holiness which goes beyond that, and beyond the idea that um, that there is an existence and a distinct entity which is expressed in the number eight. Excuse me. Okay, so this idea, continuing on with this idea that the Kli Yakar gives as an answer, somehow doesn't sound forceful enough or strong enough. Because if the eighth day stands for this idea of beyond the pale or beyond um, human experience. Okay. So, being that that's the idea of the eight and seven, we want to go further into this idea of between eight and seven. The eighth day stands for a state of absolute connection and unity with God, because it's one above, or not just one above, but it encompasses the idea of a unity with Hashem. So it signifies supernatural. In that case, when we talk about supernatural, when that means it's a state above, beyond the state of consecration, which was represented by human activity, the natural order, earthly time, where the clear implication of the phrase the eighth day is that it's a continuation of the previous seven. So the answer to that is that everything depends on human efforts. The ultimate revelation of Mashiach and the Messianic age will be brought about by our acts of goodness and kindness and service to Hashem. And it'll be brought about because of our efforts to make holy the 7 days of human time, and they will elicit a divine response by the ultimate bringing of Mashiach, and that's the eighth day. So although the Mashiach's time will be on an altogether higher level of holiness, we can evoke our divine presence in the present. It won't be a total different break, but it'll be the outcome of what we do now. So in that sense, the eighth day does come as a continuation. It comes at the conclusion of the 7 days, or the idea of activity of human involvement. And this level of completion, of total perfection, comes after we put in all the effort, and we put in all the effort that we're capable of. Now, this plays itself out even in our realms of existence. That is the idea of Shabbos. The idea of Shabbos is actually, the idea of Shabbos has got the two connections. Firstly, number one, it's part of the week. It's part of the 7 days that we understand. So Shabbos is part of the week, and therefore Shabbos is part of our weekly existence. Now, although Shabbos is a day which is different, as Shabbos is a day when we shamer as the Shabbos, where we guard the Shabbos, and we do and we nases as the Shabbos, we do the Shabbos, right? So, but Shabbos is something that we make, and in fact, the expression talks about that a person who prepares for Shabbos prepares his food, eats on Shabbos, right? Because you can't do any preparation, you can't do any from scratch food preparation on Shabbos itself. So something in a global sense, we are doing that same thing with the Messianic age. For for we are preparing in our 7 days of existence, we are preparing something for Shabbos, for that Shabbos time, which will be the times of the Mashiach. And this is like a gift from Hashem. And there's a difference between a gift and a reward. A reward is something which a recipient has earned, and a gift is something he receives only through the grace of the person who's giving. And there is a facet, or there's an aspect of Shabbos, which is something which is given to us that's purely on an exalted level, which is purely as a gift from Hashem. It's a holiness which goes beyond our human limitations. But notwithstanding that it's a gift, we have to work for it. The rabbis say that if the giver of the gift wouldn't be happy about it, he wouldn't give the gift. So there's some sort of input from 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 the recipient to the giver. That is, if it wouldn't be that we give pleasure to the one who's giving us the gift, we wouldn't necessarily receive his gifts. So therefore, as we said, someone who prepares on Erev Shabbos, right, he's the one who will eat on Shabbos, because our labors are because we're given a divine gift, which far outweighs the worth of our work, but it is part of the efforts that we do. Now, the same is true about the revelations within the sanctuary on that 8th day. Although it was not earned by the human activity of consecration on the previous 7 days, it wasn't an absolute given that it would happen. It was only when this consecration was completed that the divine response came. And in fact, on the 8th day, as the Parsha tells us, Aaron was a little bit despondent because he thought that Hashem's not going to reveal himself and send his revelation. And what was his revelation? That a fire came down from heaven and ate up and consumed the korban. A fire came up. The people and Aaron himself were somewhat despondent. And then Moses prayed, and Hashem did that final revelation. But the idea being that there didn't have to be a response. There was a response, but there didn't have to be the response. And it was only when this consecration was completed in the 7th day and then at the inauguration of Aaron on the 8th day that God gave his gift to man, only after everything man had been done. And that is why it's called the 8th day, because this is the day of divine revelation, which answers the 7 days of man's own initiative, drawing close to God, going in close to God. So that teaches us that every revelation and every level of holiness that, that we do can't be just a gift from the God, but we have to do the preparatory parts as work. We have to be a level. We have to prepare ourselves. We have to make ourselves a vessel for revelation of Hashem, and then with that, Hashem will respond to us and give us an extra level of holiness, like on the day of Shabbat. But then, if we have a complete and ultimate revelation, that is in the times of Mashiach, that'll be a level of 8, the level of Shmini, something which is totally beyond anything that we could, through our own efforts, elicit, but comes and is a total gift from Hashem. Okay, so I wish you all a good week, and we'll learn again in our next opportunity.